I was having coffee with an old friend the other day, someone who holds her faith very, very close. We were discussing a recent loss, and she was explaining what gave her comfort. It's the certainty, she said, her hands wrapped tightly around her mug. The knowledge that they're in a better place, that God is just, and that this life, it's all a test for the real reward. She spoke about it as this ancient, unshakable pillar of her belief, something handed down from the very beginning, from the patriarchs, from the prophets. To her, this promise of resurrection and divine justice wasn't just part of the faith, it was the entire point. And then I asked a question very gently. But what if it wasn't? What if that idea isn't actually in those early stories? The look she gave me wasn't anger. It was a deep, profound confusion. Because in the world of the early Hebrew scriptures, there was no heaven or hell. There was no final judgment. There was just Sheol. A gray, silent shadow world where everyone went righteous and wicked alike with no reward and no punishment. The idea that a just God would one day raise the dead to reward the good and punish the evil, that simply didn't exist. Which raises a fascinating question. If the idea of resurrection and divine justice wasn't there from the start, where did it come from?
That's probably the most profound theological question you can ask about the Abrahamic faiths, really. Because you're hitting on this core realization that early Israelite belief, the stuff we see in the oldest layers of tradition, it just lacked this crucial element, this idea of a final individual divine reckoning.
Yeah, it's completely absent.
Exactly. And it suggests that the afterlife, as most people understand it today, wasn't some revelation handed down whole at Mount Sinai. It feels more like an invention, a necessary one, a pretty radical theological transformation, actually, driven by huge political upheaval, existential crisis.
Okay.
We can sort of break this evolution down to maybe 3 fundamental shifts that really had to happen almost at the same time. You needed a shift in how people saw the nature of God, a necessary rethinking of Israel's identity, and then flowing from that, a complete overhaul of how divine justice even worked in the universe.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Let's start with that baseline you mentioned, the early cosmology. Before heaven and hell, before reward and punishment, there was just this one place for everyone who died. Sheol. What exactly was it like? And, why did that system work for them at the time?
Right. Sheol was absolutely crucial because its neutrality, really, defined the limits of divine power back then. When you died, that was it. Everyone, didn't matter if you were righteous, wicked, king, peasant. Everyone went to this silent, inescapable shadow world. The descriptions we get in the Hebrew Bible are, they're profoundly bleak. Stillness, darkness, dust. That's the picture. And the inhabitants, the dead, they're often called the Rephaim.
Rephaim. That means something like shades or the weak ones, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's good translation. They're spirits, shades of the dead, but they're completely devoid of substance. No wisdom, no real consciousness, no strength. They just exist in this silent, gray stasis. And the most critical point about Sheol, you see this echoed in Psalms, Job, is that the dead can't praise God. They can't interact with him.
So they're kind of useless to Yahweh from that perspective.
In a way, yes. Their existence doesn't serve him, and his power doesn't actively manage their fate there. In Sheol, and this universal leveling, everyone ending up in the same neutral state, was necessary because it meant all divine justice, all the rewards and punishments had to happen before you died in this life.
Okay. So Sheol isn't just like a place on a map of the cosmos. It's a philosophical boundary marker. It proves that once you died, you were effectively outside God's active intervention. No final judgment, no heaven, no hell.
Precisely. A barrier. And that neutrality is tied directly to how they understood Yahweh in the early stages, because the Yahweh of the earliest traditions, the fragments of old Psalms, the earliest narrative strands, he wasn't the universal, omnipresent, omniscient God that most people think of today.
Right. And that's the bit that often trips people up, I think. It's counterintuitive to us now. We really have to sort of mentally rewind and see Yahweh initially as a more regional deity. Geographically limited, tied to a specific area outside the main settled lands of Canaan, which brings us to something called the Kenite hypothesis.
Indeed, the Kenite hypothesis. It's a theory, but a pretty well-supported one, that suggests Yahweh originated as a god worshipped by nomadic groups in the south, specifically groups linked to the Midianites and the Kenites. And this isn't just, scholars guessing. It's woven right into Israel's own foundational stories.
The story of Moses meeting Jethro, his father-in-law, being the prime example here.
That's the narrative linchpin, absolutely.
Yeah.
Moses escapes Egypt. He goes to Midian, lives among these people. And his father-in-law, Jethro, isn't just some guy he's explicitly called the priest of Midian. According to the story, it's Jethro who introduces Moses to the divine name Yahweh. So the narrative itself links the god's origin powerfully to the south, to these rugged, non-Canaanite regions like Sinai or Horeb.
It places the name, the core identity, outside the established Canaanite culture.
Exactly. And then you've got external evidence that lines up with this.
Not just theology, but actual historical geography.
Right. Archaeology helps here. We have Egyptian topographical lists, records from the 13th and 12th centuries BC, so pretty early. And they mention a term, Y, which scholars connect to Yahu or Yahweh, and they associate it with the Shasu nomads.
Shasu nomads, where were they?
They lived in the lands of Seir and Edom, which are regions in southern Transjordan, southeast of Canaan proper. So this non-biblical evidence strongly reinforces the idea that the early Yahweh cult had roots among these semi-nomadic groups in the south.
Okay, so Yahweh doesn't sort of bubble up from the heartland of Canaanite farming villages. He arrives on the scene, conceptually at least, as this powerful outsider god, god of the wilder places, the elements.
That's very much the initial characterization, what scholars often call the theophany tradition. The really old poems embedded in the text, like the Song of Deborah in Judges 5, parts of Deuteronomy 33, Habakkuk 3, they consistently paint this picture. Yahweh as a warrior god, marching, appearing, striding out from the southeast, from Sinai, Seir, Taman, Paran, always from that southern direction.
And associated with storms and mountains?
Yes, very strongly. Attributes like cloud, fire, thunder, earthquake. He's the divine warrior arriving in power.
And this imagery, the storm god, the war god, that's significant because it overlaps quite a bit with other gods already in the region, doesn't it?
It does, and that shows this dynamic process of cultural and religious interaction, even appropriation. Yahweh's warrior and storm aspects were often deliberately compared with, or maybe even borrowed from, established Canaanite gods, like Baal, who's the big storm god in the region.
Right, Baal Hadad.
Exactly. And El, who was the sort of high father god of the Canaanite pantheon, by taking on these powerful attributes, Yahweh's followers were positioning him as equal to, or maybe even stronger than, the most important local deities.
But still, fundamentally, he's acting as the protector and deliverer for his specific group, Israel.
That's the key point early on. His primary role is national.
Okay, but if he's this mighty warrior, this storm god, why doesn't he need an afterlife system of justice yet? Why stick with just Sheol?
Because his power, his jurisdiction, was understood primarily in national terms, not individual. It was temporally limited. It operated within the boundaries of earthly life. The core operating system was covenant theology. The deal between Yahweh and Israel was collective.
The whole nation together.
Yes. If the nation as a whole behaved, if they kept the covenant rules, worshipped only Yahweh, maintained social justice, then Yahweh provided collective blessings.
Like what? Military victory, good harvest.
Exactly. Victory in battle, sufficient rain, fertile land, security from enemies, blessings you could see and feel here and now.
And the flip side, if the nation messed up.
Then came the curses. Again, immediate, collective, tangible.
Right.
If the nation failed morally widespread idol worship, social injustice, breaking covenant laws, Yahweh delivered punishment. Defeat by enemies, drought, famine, plagues. And the ultimate curse, being kicked off the land, exile. Justice was administered through geopolitics and agriculture, basically.
So it was all very immediate, very this worldly.
Very.
So let's say you're a really good person, you follow all the rules, but you live during a time when the nation is generally corrupt. And maybe you suffer terribly, you're poor, you die young, maybe you're even falsely accused and imprisoned.
Under this early system, that was essentially bad luck, or maybe seen as an unfortunate consequence of the nation's overall sinfulness. Your individual fate wasn't the primary focus of divine justice.
There was no cosmic balancing of the scales for you after death.
No. Individual suffering or prosperity didn't get reconciled beyond the grave, because Yahweh's power wasn't thought to operate that way in Sheol. Since the justice system worked only in this life and mainly on the national level, the neutral, passive Sheol made perfect sense. It fulfilled its function.
Why invent a system of post-mortem judgment when justice, as they understood it, was happening right here, right now, on the battlefield or in the weather pattern?
Precisely. There was simply no theological need for it yet. The system worked, until, of course, it completely catastrophically failed.
Right. And that sets the stage for the major crisis, because even before the final collapse, this national covenant idea was already under strain from within, wasn't it? Mainly because of religious mixing, syncretism.
Yes, absolutely. We have to sort of get rid of this modern picture of ancient Israel and Judah as being uniformly monotheistic from day one. It just wasn't like that. During the time of the kings, the monarchical period, sure, you had prophets arguing for a Yahweh alone approach, but that seems to have been a minority view, or at least not the standard practice for many people. This era, which really leads into the crisis, was marked by deep religious pluralism. It was messy.
Syncretism was more the norm. People worshiping Yahweh, but also alongside other gods. Gods maybe promising things Yahweh wasn't typically associated with, like maybe fertility.
Exactly. And we don't just have to rely on the Bible's own internal criticisms of this, which are often written later with a specific agenda.
Yeah.
We have actual physical proof.
Archaeology again.
Archaeology gives us a reality check against the heavily edited biblical text. The most famous, really undeniable examples of this syncretism come from inscriptions found at two sites. One is Kutale Adrud, a sort of desert outpost dated around 800 BC. The other is Khirbet el-Qam in Judah, maybe 75 years later, around 725 BC.
And what's so explosive about these inscriptions?
They contain blessings invoked explicitly by Yahweh and his Asherah.
His Asherah, as in the Canaanite goddess Asherah.
The very same. Asherah was a major Canaanite mother goddess, a fertility goddess, often seen as the consort of the high god El. Finding these inscriptions, where people are casually asking for blessings from Yahweh and his divine partner, proves that worshiping a consort alongside Yahweh wasn't just some fringe heresy. It was part of the popular, maybe even official religious practice in both the northern kingdom, Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judah.
Wow, okay, hold on. If this was common, Yahweh and Asherah, how did people see their roles working together? Yahweh's the warrior god, right? Asherah's about fertility.
It actually makes a certain kind of functional sense, doesn't it? She sort of fills a void. Yahweh is about sovereignty, protection, national defense, the storm, the battle. Asherah covers fertility, life, maybe domestic well-being, childbirth. It's like a division of divine labor, ensuring all the bases of life were covered by the gods they worshipped.
A divine power couple managing different portfolios.
You could put it that way. And there's pretty strong evidence, both from archaeology and reading between the lines in the biblical text itself, that symbols of Asherah, maybe sacred poles or trees, were actually set up within the temple complex in Jerusalem at various times.
In the temple itself?
Yes. Some scholars connect her with the figure referred to polemically as the Queen of Heaven in Jeremiah. So this wasn't just popular folk religion out in the villages. It seems to have been institutionalized right at the center, at least until various religious reforms tried to stamp it out.
So the political and religious reality for centuries was essentially, well, maybe not full polytheism, but certainly a system where Yahweh was the chief national god, but he wasn't alone. He had company, including a consort.
It seems that way. A kind of practical henotheism or monolatry, perhaps, acknowledging other divine powers, even while focusing primary loyalty on Yahweh.
And that entire worldview, that whole system just shattered?
It completely imploded. The beginning of the end was the Assyrian Empire crushing the northern kingdom Samaria around 722 BC, deporting huge chunks of the population, the so-called Lost 10 Tribes. That was a massive blow. But the truly defining catastrophe, the one that forced a fundamental reckoning, was the Babylonian conquest of Judah in 586 BC.
That's the big one. The destruction of Jerusalem, the burning of Solomon's temple.
Exactly. The holiest site gone, the end of the Davidic royal line, the kings descended from David, and the exile of the ruling class, the priests, the scribes, the artisans, to Babylon.
The cognitive dissonance, the theological crisis that must have caused, it's hard to overstate. If Yahweh is your all-powerful divine warrior, your national protector, the supreme God, how could he possibly allow his own chosen people, his holy city, his actual house on earth, the temple, to be utterly demolished by the armies and presumably the gods of Babylon?
That's the unbearable question. The old covenant theology, obey and win, disobey and lose it, just failed. Catastrophically. Victory was supposed to prove divine favor. Defeat like this. It seemed to prove Yahweh was weaker than Marduk, the god of Babylon.
Which would mean the whole religion was basically wrong, invalid.
Precisely. So the survivors, whether they were in exile in Babylon or struggling back at the ruined homeland, they needed a new explanation. A complete, coherent theological answer that could make sense of this disaster and allow them to continue as a people, as a faith community. If Yahweh had simply lost, it was game over.
So the intellectual leaders, the scribes, the thinkers, they had to find a way to argue that Yahweh hadn't lost at all, that somehow he had actually planned this horrific defeat.
That is the absolute pivot point, a moment of astonishing theological reengineering. This is where the work of the Deuteronomistic redactors becomes so crucial. These are the scribes and editors, working probably during the exile itself and in the period just after the return, who took all these older traditions, chronicles, laws, and stories,
And wove them together.
yes, wove them into a single overarching narrative, what scholars call the Deuteronomistic history, basically the books from Joshua through 2 Kings.
And this wasn't just compiling history, it was shaping it. It was theological argument disguised as history writing, a strategic reframing of the entire past to explain the present catastrophe.
Absolutely, you could call it theological propaganda, in a way. The core message of these de-redactors, hammered home again and again, was this: Yahweh was not defeated by Babylon's gods. Not at all. Babylon, the mighty empire, was merely the tool, the instrument, the rod of anger in Yahweh's hand.
Ah, so Yahweh used Babylon.
He used Babylon to inflict a just and necessary punishment on his own people. Why? Because of Israel's and Judah's centuries of moral failure, all that idolatry, the syncretism with Asherah and Baal, the social injustice, the kings leading the people astray. The exile wasn't proof of Yahweh's weakness, it was proof of his unwavering commitment to his own covenant law.
So the sheer scale of the destruction, the temple gone, the kingdom annihilated, now becomes evidence for Yahweh's power and justice, not against it. The punishment finally fits the crime.
Exactly, it validates his justice, but, and this is the crucial consequence, to make that argument stick, they had to fundamentally upgrade Yahweh's job description.
He couldn't just be the local national god anymore.
No way. If he's powerful enough to use the Babylonian Empire like a puppet, he can't be just some regional deity who fights Israel's battles. He has to be elevated. He must become a morally absolute universal God, sovereign over all nations, including Babylon, sovereign over the entire cosmos.
Only a god with that kind of universal power could plausibly use a foreign superpower to discipline his own people.
Right. This forced elevation to universal monotheism, the strict Yahweh alone doctrine finally taking center stage, was absolutely essential for cultural and religious survival. It gave the exiles a powerful reason to maintain their identity and their faith. They weren't the abandoned followers of a defeated tribal god. They were the chastened, but still chosen, people of the one true master of the universe.
It's an incredible theological pivot.
It really is. And what's also fascinating is who seems to have been pushing this stricter, monotheistic view long before the exile, providing the ideological groundwork.
It wasn't necessarily the mainstream establishment in Jerusalem.
The evidence suggests it wasn't. The movement towards this uncompromising Yahweh alone viewpoint seems to have been championed, or at least preserved, by groups on the margins, on the social and geographical periphery.
Groups that had maybe resisted the settled, urban, syncretistic lifestyle all along.
Exactly. Groups like the Kenites, remember, Moses' father-in-law's people, linked to the origins of Yahwism, and another group called the Rechabites. These groups seem to have held on to an older, maybe more austere, more conservative Sinai theology, a theology that demanded sole, exclusive loyalty to Yahweh. Their ideology was often rooted in nomadic or semi-nomadic ideals. They were suspicious of settled city life, which they associated with Canaanite religious corruption, like the fertility cults.
Can you give an example? What did the Rechabites do?
The Rechabites are fascinating. We hear about them in the book of Jeremiah. They had taken this incredibly strict oath generations earlier, based on the command of their ancestor, Jonadab, son of Rechab. They refused to drink wine. They refused to plant crops or own vineyards. They refused to build permanent houses. They insisted on living in tents.
Wow, that's extreme.
It is. It's a deliberate, radical commitment to a simple, mobile, non-agricultural lifestyle. It was basically a living, symbolic protest against the settled, complex, and in their view, religiously compromised culture of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, a rejection of assimilation into Canaanite ways.
So when the disaster of the exile happened, destroying that very settled culture they rejected, their fringe position suddenly looked like prophecy, like moral vindication.
Precisely. They could say, see, we told you so. This is what happens when you abandon the pure worship of Yahweh and adopt foreign ways. Their unwavering loyalty to Yahweh alone, untainted by the Asherah poles and Baal altars of the cities, meant their minority viewpoint gained immense prestige after the collapse.
So their ideas became influential in shaping the post-exilic future.
Very likely. The scribal class, the ones doing the work of compiling and editing the sacred texts during and after the exile, and some traditions explicitly link certain scribal families to the Kenites. They seem to have drawn heavily on this conservative, monotheistic ideology. It provided the theological fuel needed to establish and enforce the new, stricter Yahweh alone Judaism that emerged after the return.
It's like institutional change being driven by the ideas from the margins that suddenly become relevant after a crisis.
A classic pattern. But here's the next problem. Elevating Yahweh to this all-powerful, morally perfect, universal sovereign creates a brand new ethical dilemma, one that's maybe even tougher than explaining the national catastrophe.
Okay, what's that?
The ethical imperative. This brings us to the third major shift. If Yahweh is now understood as universally sovereign, absolutely moral, and perfectly just, what do you do about the unavoidable problem of individual suffering, especially the suffering of the righteous?
Right. The old covenant model kind of explained national suffering, the nation's sin, so the nation got punished with exile. That explanation, however harsh, holds together on a collective level.
Exactly. But now, think about the individual. The exile ends, some people return, or even those who stayed or those living under subsequent foreign rule, Persian, Greek, later Roman. Imagine someone who lives a genuinely righteous life according to this new, strict moral code. They worship only Yahweh, they're honest, they help the poor, yet they still suffer. They get sick, they die young, they're oppressed, maybe even killed for their faith during periods of persecution.
Well, at the same time, they see wicked people, oppressors, collaborators, maybe even pagans, prospering, getting rich, living long lives, holding power.
That is the absolute theological breaking point for universal monotheism. If a God who is perfectly just and all-powerful allows the righteous individual to suffer terribly while the wicked flourish with no final balancing of the scales, then his moral law starts to look arbitrary, almost meaningless.
If death just leads to the same neutral, silent Sheol for both the martyr and the tyrant, what was the point of being righteous?
Exactly. The old system of purely earthly, mainly national justice, completely breaks down under the weight of this new understanding of God as universally moral and sovereign over individuals. To maintain the theological integrity of this universal God, his justice couldn't end at the grave. It had to extend beyond.
The jurisdiction needed to expand to keep the system coherent.
It was an ethical necessity. It was simply unavoidable if the concept of a just, universal God was to survive. How could a God whose moral authority supposedly covers the entire cosmos allow such fundamental injustice, the righteous suffering unjustly, to just stand, unreconciled? This problem became incredibly acute, especially in later times, like during the persecution under the Greek Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century BC, which is the background for the book of Daniel.
People were literally dying for their faith.
Yes, martyrs. And the question becomes overwhelming. Where is their justice? The only possible solution was to extend the timeline. Justice delayed, perhaps, but not ultimately denied. It had to come after death.
Okay, so if they needed afterlife justice, how did the thinkers and writers actually create the cosmological space for it? They had to somehow argue that Yahweh ruled Sheol too, right? That it wasn't outside his control after all.
Yes, that was the key move. And they did it, essentially, by rewriting the history of the entire universe, establishing Yahweh's credentials not just as Israel's God, but as the supreme creator and ruler of all reality. The writers and editors, particularly those working in the exilic and post-exilic periods, systematically took older mythological traditions, creation stories, flood stories, and they historicized them, repurposed them. Their goal was to demonstrate Yahweh's ultimate, absolute, continuous sovereignty over all of time and all of space from the very beginning, to prove his role as the sole creator and the unchallenged king over all existence.
We tend to read Genesis 1 or the flood story as just ancient tales about origins, but you're saying their final theological function in the context of the developing Bible was actually to establish Yahweh's universal jurisdiction.
That became a primary function, yes. Think about many ancient Near Eastern creation myths. Often they involve a high god battling and defeating primordial chaos, frequently personified as a great watery monster, the abyss, Tiamat in the Babylonian version.
Right.
By weaving narratives where Yahweh is the one who effortlessly commands the waters, who sets the boundaries for the deep, who controls the foundations of the earth and everything under the earth, they are making a powerful statement. They are demonstrating, narratively, that Yahweh's power isn't stopped by the boundaries of the living world or the gates of Sheol. He created it all. He controls it all.
So by showing Yahweh conquering or controlling the abyss, which is the symbolic realm of chaos, death, the underworld, they effectively proved His authority extends right into Sheol itself.
That's the logical conclusion. The moment Yahweh is definitively established, not just as a national God, but as the creator and ongoing ruler of the entire cosmos, including the depths, the underworld, well, then Sheol can no longer be some autonomous neutral zone outside his reach.
It just becomes another part of his universal kingdom.
Another province, yes. And once that's established, the stage is fully set for divine judgment after death. If Yahweh is the universal king, the ultimate moral judge, and his rule extends everywhere, even into the realm of the dead, then he not only can, but must eventually exercise that power to sort things out, to separate the wicked from the righteous, even after they've died.
Which means that the emergence of belief in resurrection, immortality, final judgment in Judaism, it wasn't just a comforting idea that was always there, it was a necessary theological and ethical solution, born directly out of lived historical suffering, exile, oppression, martyrdom, and the absolute need to make sense of that suffering under this newly established, all-powerful, perfectly just, universal God.
It really was an ethical imperative. You can trace the development. The shift from a God who primarily demanded national political loyalty to a God who demanded personal moral behavior in every aspect of life. That shift necessitated a final reckoning. Without the promise of resurrection for the righteous and judgment for the wicked beyond the grave, the whole edifice of universal divine justice, this new understanding of God, would ultimately crumble under the weight of observed reality. And you see this reaching its full flowering in later biblical books like Daniel, written precisely during a time of intense persecution. The promise of resurrection for the martyrs isn't just wishful thinking, it's the theological linchpin, holding the whole system of meaning together. It validates their sacrifice and God's justice.
So looking back at the whole sweep of this, it really is quite a journey. The afterlife concepts we often take for granted weren't the starting point of the faith at all. They were more like the finish line of this long, complex, often painful, centuries-long theological marathon. It started with a geographically limited God and a neutral underworld. It got supercharged by the trauma of political destruction and exile, forcing a radical rethink of God's nature, and it culminated in this universal, morally absolute monotheism. And the need for things like resurrection and final judgment wasn't there from the beginning, but emerged as the necessary, inescapable ethical solution to square the circle, to reconcile the reality of suffering, especially righteous suffering, with the absolute justice demanded of this newly understood universal God.
That's a great way to put it. That transition from a God primarily concerned with national politics and collective earthly consequences to a God intensely focused on personal, individual morality, requiring ultimate cosmic justice, that transition fundamentally required the death of the old neutral universe. It required the birth of a new cosmological framework, one where justice was absolutely guaranteed, even if its final administration had to be postponed until the world to come. So the idea of the afterlife, in this sense, isn't just about what happens when you die. It's fundamentally an enduring monument, etched into theology, testifying to the profound, centuries-long struggle of faithful people trying to make sense of immense historical suffering and loss, while holding on to their belief in a just God.